Welcome to this story, one of the most unsettling cases ever noted in 1876 Oklahoma Territory, Wild West Secrets, the Seamstress with a Sinister Trade. Before we dive in, share in the comments where you're tuning in from and the exact time you started listening. It's always interesting to see the different places and hours of the day or night where these stories reach. In 1876, the lands that would later come to be known as Oklahoma Territory were still loosely defined, overlapping with Indian Territory and lands not yet fully organized under U.S. governance. Though the formal designation Oklahoma Territory would only arrive with the Organic Act in 1890, the frontier atmosphere and jurisdictional ambiguity were ever present in the region. We'll return to that in a moment. That year, on a remote parcel of prairie just east of a scattering of settlers, a woman named Clara Beaumont arrived in a small cabin built beside a dusty wagon road. She came from the neighboring state of Missouri, claiming she wished only to open a sewing studio for frontier folk. Witnesses said she traveled by mule, her trunk loaded with bolts of fabric, needles, and shears. The cabin she chose lay half a mile from the nearest outpost, surrounded by grassland and the hush of distant night. Her first weeks passed quietly, a dress mended here, a patch stitched there, small jobs for homesteaders, widows, and traveling families. In journal entries from an itinerant preacher, there is a brief mention. She works by lamplight, calm and silent. Her presence gives no outward warning. But rumors grew in town. People whispered that garments she finished sometimes held small, unexpected stains or residual pungent odor. A farmer's wife claimed her dress felt heavier around the hem after Clara altered it. Others reported hearing soft snips late at night when Clara's cabin was supposed to be dark. By autumn, strange disappearances began. Two young travelers, en route west, passed through her vicinity and vanished. Their wagons were found abandoned along the trail. The harnesses lay cut, as though shears had been involved. A deputy from the nearest settlement came to investigate. He recorded that Clara's sewing studio had no guest log, no receipts. Her ledger book showed only bolts of fabric purchased, no income entries. Yet, among local whispers, a man named Joseph Harrow, a wagon driver, claimed he saw Clara kneeling in moonlight at the edge of her workshop, a large pair of shears in hand, and a shape on the ground beside her that coiled like a body but moved like a cat. Others dismissed it as superstition. In county records from a nearby township, later merged into what would become Logan County, a petition was filed in late 1880 complaining of strange noises and foul smells around Clara's cabin. The clerk's notation is sparse but says, "Several nights the hamlet was woken by the sound of scissors against wood and a low moaning." The petitioners claimed they dared not approach after dusk. Through the next winter, the episodes escalated. Livestock vanished, shallow graves were found beyond Clara's cabin walls, and faint footprints circled the structure at odd angles. A visiting constable from Kansas noted that Clara's cabin door was always locked after dark, and a cold draft slipped under its threshold, even in summertime. At this point, some in the frontier communities started comparing Clara's case to dark legends of seamstresses with secret trades in the older states. The unsettled governance of the region, part frontier, part Indian territory, made legal jurisdiction confusing. This dynamic would echo later when Oklahoma Territory was formally created, as settlers and courts scrambled to assert authority in these borderlands. By early 1877, what little remained of community trust around Clara Beaumont had eroded entirely. Letters from neighboring settlers described a palpable unease. No one would pass her cabin after sundown. The Oklahoma Territory region, as historians later called it in records following the Organic Act of 1890, was a patchwork of shifting control and suspicion. In such places, law moved slower than fear. That winter was colder than most. Bitter winds swept across the plains, carrying dust and frost into the seams of every home. The postmaster in a nearby settlement recalled in his diary that Clara's chimney smoked at odd hours. "She burns her lamp until dawn," he wrote, "and sometimes I smell tallow and burnt cloth drifting from her direction." Then, in February, a drifter named Elias Ford went missing. He'd been seen trading a worn coat with Clara, a fair barter, he told others, but he never collected it. Weeks later, a tattered garment resembling that coat was discovered hanging behind her cabin, hemmed with what one neighbor swore was horsehair. Rumors spread faster than justice. The local minister urged calm, warning against devilish invention, but even he avoided Clara's trail. One field hand told of finding several buttons embedded in the soil near a dried creek bed, different shapes and colors, as if cut hastily from many coats. Each bore faint rust, though the ground there rarely stayed wet. When a deputy marshal from Kansas crossed the border to investigate, he found Clara calm, even polite. Her sewing table was immaculate. "A woman of industry," he noted, "who keeps her own company." But something in the floorboards caught his attention, a darkened patch of wood, circular, roughly the size of a basin. Clara claimed she had spilled dye. The deputy, unfamiliar with the terrain and wary of local politics, left the matter to town officials. In later accounts, cited decades after in a local chronicle referencing Oklahoma Territory's early lawlessness, the deputy's visit marked the last time she was seen by lawful eyes. Soon after, her cabin stood empty. The sewing machine remained. The shears lay open on the table. The fire had gone cold. In 1881, when a new family purchased the land, they dismantled what was left of the cabin. Beneath the flooring, they found scraps of unbleached linen stitched into uneven squares, each marked faintly with initials in thread. Townsfolk whispered that those initials matched the missing. Wanderers, peddlers, farmhands. The constable refused to confirm, saying only that the fragments were burned for decency. Some claimed that on quiet nights, when the wind blew from the north, a sound like snipping scissors could still be heard over the prairie. And though no body of Clara Beaumont was ever recovered, several drifters later reported seeing a woman matching her description near Guthrie, years before the territory's official founding. She was always dressed in gray, carrying a folded bundle, her eyes fixed downward, as though measuring something unseen. By the spring of 1882, the story of the Seamstress of the Plains had become a warning whispered among wagon trails. New settlers avoided her former homestead, calling it the Quiet Patch. The land itself seemed unwilling to hold roots. Crops failed, fences collapsed, and even animals skirted the area. The events around Oklahoma Territory, as later historians reconstructed from sparse notes, reflected that uneasy limbo before governance reached the frontier. As in the earlier years, described in the Oklahoma Territory archives, superstition often filled the space left by absent law. It was around this time that a traveling photographer, Henry Daw, passed through the region. He was documenting frontier life and recorded an eerie entry in his logbook. "Stopped near the old seamstress place. Air hung thick with quiet. Found bits of lace buried shallow. No birds, only wind." Daw developed one glass plate that he said captured a blurred figure by a doorframe, though the negative was later lost in a fire. The surviving print, faint and scratched, shows only the outline of a woman's silhouette, thin, deliberate, with something in her hand. The townsfolk, shown the image, refused to hang it. Meanwhile, the town constable, Ezekiel Ward, reopened the missing persons list. He traced several disappearances along the same north-south route Clara had once taken. Each stop corresponded to a small hamlet where a needlewoman had offered mending for travelers. One saloon keeper from Kansas reported finding a roll of thread soaked dark and stiff in a room rented under a false name, C. Bowman. Ward filed his findings in a short affidavit, now partially preserved in county archives. "There is a pattern of trade and silence moving southward. Whoever she was, she did not rest." By 1885, settlers pushing west found remnants of her presence in unlikely places: folded fabric, buried beneath floorboards, half-finished garments stitched shut without openings, and wooden boxes marked with dates but no names. One such box, unearthed near an abandoned coach stop, contained several locks of hair and a pair of shears bound shut with twine. Local clergy warned that to speak her name invited misfortune. Still, stories persisted. Children dared one another to whisper the seamstress's measure by moonlight. Ranch hands swore that at dusk, when the wind blew through torn canvas, it sounded like the pull of thread. In later academic reviews of frontier folklore, researchers often cited this case as part of the unrecorded crimes of the unsettled territories. A brief mention in Oklahoma Territory studies linked her legend to fears of isolation and frontier anonymity, how a person might vanish into miles of open land, unclaimed by any law. Yet in every retelling, one detail remained constant: that faint, rhythmic sound in the prairie nights. 2 metallic clicks, a pause, then another, like scissors closing softly in the dark. By 1887, the few settlers who remained near the overgrown trail leading to Clara Beaumont's former cabin began to notice strange disturbances again, lights flickering where no lamp should be, and the faint scent of smoke and oil on nights without wind. The old land grant records from the region, now categorized under Oklahoma Territory documentation in later decades, described the area as abandoned due to persistent superstition. Even when new buyers tried to claim the property, they withdrew within months. One notable incident came from a cattleman named Levi Porter, who was driving his herd south near the Cimarron River. In a letter to his wife, he wrote, "Passed the Beaumont lot at dusk. Saw a glow through the window frame. Thought someone had rebuilt. But when I went close, there was nothing but a sewing table and a cat black as coal sitting where the fire once was." That single mention of the black cat appears in 3 different newspaper clippings from nearby town presses, each claiming Levi refused to return to the site. One article, the Guthrie Clarion, 1891, referred to it as the last trace of a cursed seamstress who measured more than cloth. By this point, the frontier had begun to civilize. Oklahoma Territory was officially recognized under U.S. law, and settlers were flooding westward. New roads were mapped, towns were incorporated, but still, no one claimed the Beaumont property. The ruins remain visible from the main wagon trail, a dark square of charred foundation stones surrounded by grass that refused to grow straight. Local folklore transformed Clara from a reclusive tailor into something spectral. In saloon retellings, she became the Thread Witch, said to sow the souls of those who trespassed after nightfall. But historians who reviewed the case decades later found plausible explanations: wildfires, misidentified animal bones, and the lingering fear of women who lived alone on the frontier. Even so, testimony persisted. A farmhand named Sarah Dobbins, then in her 70s, told an interviewer in 1910, "My father said she weren't evil, just lost. Folks drove her mad with talk and no company. Said she stitched her grief into things." It's a haunting observation, and one that softened the story's edges in later retellings. But the physical remnants never vanished entirely. In 1893, when a survey crew passed through to plot new fence lines, one worker reportedly unearthed a rusted pair of shears near where the hearth had once stood. The blades were fused shut with corrosion, the handle engraved faintly with an initial, CB. The foreman filed a report, but the artifact was lost in transit to the territorial office. Some say it was stolen as a curiosity, others that it broke apart in a wagon fire. Either way, it was never documented again. And still, on windless nights, travelers described hearing the same faint, repetitive sound across the empty plains. 2 clean metallic clicks, and silence, as though some unfinished task awaited completion beneath the soil. By 1890, the region had begun to fill with homesteaders under the newly formalized Oklahoma Territory. Towns sprang up, telegraph lines hummed, and even the oldest rumors seemed destined to fade beneath the noise of expansion. Yet, in the district once known as the Beaumont Tract, unease still clung to the air like a cold mist. The land was purchased that year by a widower named Thomas Eden, a man of practical temperament who dismissed superstition as cowards' talk. Eden moved into a small cabin built atop the remains of Clara's workshop. He reported no disturbances for months, until one October evening, when returning from the fields, he found his door ajar. Inside, his chair had been moved. On the table lay a folded square of muslin, unhemmed, marked faintly with a hand-stitched L. He swore he owned no such cloth. Eden showed it to a neighbor, who refused to touch it. Within days, the widower packed his wagon and left the property, writing in his final note to the local land office, "The house keeps its own company." The next occupant was Dr. Alistair Pruitt, a physician from Topeka who believed the site's reputation might draw patients seeking psychological novelty. He documented the area's phenomena carefully, recording sounds and temperatures, even soil density. In his surviving papers, Pruitt noted hearing the unmistakable rhythmic pattern of cutting, like fabric sheared in darkness. The doctor stayed 6 weeks before leaving abruptly, abandoning his instruments. Local students who explored the property years later claimed that Pruitt's notes, still legible in the margins of a field journal, contained a sketch of a woman's hand holding a curved pair of shears. Across the bottom he'd written, "Measured wrong." Throughout the 1890s, Oklahoma Territory officials focused on modernizing their archives and infrastructure. The Territorial Enterprise. It reported on the Beaumont land only once more, in 1896, after a surveyor stumbled upon a buried chest containing fragments of thread and a rusted needle case. No official record followed. Still, whispers persisted among settlers and stage drivers. They spoke of a black cat seen pacing near the ruins on certain moonless nights, its eyes faintly glinting like fire coals, vanishing the moment someone looked straight at it. Children would dare one another to leave scraps of fabric near the stones and return in the morning. The fabric was always gone. When a territorial judge reviewed property disputes in 1898, he remarked, "The Beaumont parcel seems to invite no owners. Its deeds travel farther than its residents ever did." By the century's end, the site lay abandoned once more. Wind cut through the empty space where Clara Beaumont's home once stood. Grass grew high, folding over the stones like a shroud. Those who ventured close said they felt watched, not with malice, but with patient, measured attention, as though something there still waited for its final stitch to be completed. The turn of the century brought optimism across the plains, but the Beaumont tract remained stubbornly unchanged, a square of prairie no one successfully tamed. In early 1901, new railroad surveyors tried once more to chart a path through the land. Among them was engineer Paul Renner, whose daily log would later surface in a bundle of recovered notes. Renner described the area as unusually still. No insects, no animal tracks. "The air feels flattened here, like sound won't carry right." One evening, while taking measurements at dusk, Renner and his crew found what they thought was a buried trunk. When they pried it open, the wood splintered and disintegrated. Inside lay not valuables, but bundles of fabric wrapped tight, stiffened with age. Each bundle bore faint embroidered letters, initials again. One notably read E.F., echoing the long-missing drifter, Elias Ford. Fearing contamination or superstition, the foreman ordered the materials reburied. The following morning, their equipment refused to calibrate. Compasses spun freely. Renner blamed magnetized iron in the soil, though no record confirmed any ore deposit nearby. The crew left after 2 days, abandoning the route entirely. The intended rail line curved 2 miles east to avoid the Beaumont parcel, a decision never officially explained. Local folklore claimed the sound of hammering spikes disturbed the ghost seamstress, while pragmatic surveyors simply said the ground didn't want steel. As time passed, the legend seeped into literature. A 1905 pamphlet on Oklahoma Territory folklore mentioned the Beaumont seamstress briefly, describing her as a woman of vanished years who worked thread and sorrow into the same cloth. Though written in the romantic language of the day, it preserved the central unease that surrounded her name. New settlers from the east occasionally stumbled upon the old stove nests, unaware of their history. Some reported finding small circles of pins stuck upright in the soil, too deliberate for chance, arranged like spokes around an invisible wheel. One traveler wrote to the Enid Gazette, calling the place an unholy patch of calm. As roads improved and towns expanded, the Beaumont tract slipped quietly off maps. Officially, it became unclaimed land. Yet every few years, Someone passing through would speak of a black cat seen walking along the ridge, sleek, patient, its tail trailing low, pausing as if listening. In the local imagination, it came to symbolize Clara's silent vigilance, guarding something beneath the earth that no one dared disturb. By 1908, the last territorial clerk referencing the case made a curious note in his ledger. No further settlement recorded. Locals insist on quiet. Better left alone. And so the record ended there, as if the land itself had closed the file. By 1910, Oklahoma had already entered statehood, and most traces of the old territorial frontier were giving way to fences, schools, and brick storefronts. Yet even as the modern world advanced, the old story of Clara Beaumont refused to fade entirely. Among the last recorded accounts tied to her legend came from a newspaper correspondent named Walter Wren, who traveled the plains collecting what he called oral fragments of vanishing folklore. Wren's notes, preserved in part at the State Archive, mentioned that several elderly settlers near the Cimarron still spoke of the woman with the measuring eyes. They described her less as a ghost and more as a lingering presence, a feeling that came over a person when walking too close to the ruins. One informant told him, "It feels like someone's watching what you wear, like they're counting the stitches on your sleeve." Wren's correspondence compared the unease around the site to early reports from the Oklahoma Territory era, when superstition and fear filled the vacuum of weak law. He wrote that her story survives because it represents a time when solitude was as dangerous as a pistol. He spent 3 days camped near the Beaumont tract, sketching the foundation stones and collecting soil samples. In his last entry, before returning east, he wrote, "Night quiet as burial, wind stirs thread-like across the grass, could swear I heard metal whispering. If sound can remember, this place does." His sketches show the remains of the hearth, the collapsed chimney, and faint impressions of wooden floor beams. Between them, he marked several small depressions he believed were deliberate graves. When excavated decades later by local historians, they found nothing but compact clay and splinters of textile fibers, brittle and gray as ash. By then, the legend had transformed into something more symbolic. Teachers told schoolchildren that the tale of Clara Beaumont was about isolation and moral decay, a lesson on how secrets fester when unshared. But older residents refused to dismiss it entirely. A farmer named Raymond Cobb, interviewed in 1915, swore he once saw a slender figure standing on the ridgeline as dusk fell, same height as a woman, but bent like she carried a weight. Whether fact or fable, such stories continued to haunt the edges of rural life. Some believed Clara's craft had been cursed. Others said she was merely the first to lose her mind to the prairie's silence. Either way, every few winters, when the frost settled evenly across the open fields, locals still avoided crossing that particular stretch of land, not from belief in spirits, but out of an inherited caution that no one could quite explain. And on those still nights, when cattle refused to graze near the stones, the only sound that broke the vast hush of the plains was faint and steady. 2 metallic clicks, measured and patient, echoing through the grass like the ghost of a trade that never truly ended. By 1916, the Beaumont legend had already faded from most public memory, replaced by tales of progress and invention. But among the remaining frontiersmen and settlers of northern Oklahoma, the name Clara Beaumont was still spoken in a careful tone, not fearful, but reverent, as if acknowledging something the land itself had chosen to keep secret. In the archives of the Oklahoma Historical Society, a marginal note appeared that year in an article reviewing forgotten territorial cases. The writer, historian Dr. Edwin Lathrop, mentioned the so-called Seamstress case, using it as an example of how lawlessness once blurred the lines between rumor and record. Lathrop, though skeptical of the supernatural, found the testimony surrounding the case unusually consistent. He wrote, "Too many people saw the same things: the empty cabin, the folded cloth, the repeated initials. Even error has pattern, and this one holds." Lathrop visited the tract himself that autumn. His field notes describe a sense of oppressive quiet, and the peculiar way the soil shifted underfoot as though hollow beneath. He brought back fragments: a rusted needle, a thimble fused with grit, and a strip of fabric so fragile it dissolved when touched. To his colleagues, he dismissed them as relics of ordinary domestic life. But in a letter to a friend found years later, he confessed, "It feels wrong to keep them indoors. The pieces hum faintly at night." That same season, a pair of young ranch hands from Guthrie reported seeing a black cat sitting among the stone remnants. They described it as larger than common, with fur that swallowed the light. When one approached, it simply turned and walked toward the prairie, leaving no prints. Though the sighting was never verified, the story spread quickly. The cat became a familiar omen in the folklore surrounding the site. By 1919, after a brush fire swept through the area, little remained of the original foundation. Locals swore that amid the ash, metal glinted, as if the old shears had surfaced again. The county records mention the fire as accidental, started by a passing train spark, but one witness insisted the flames moved too neat, like they followed a drawn line. When the smoke cleared, nothing but scorched stones and a single square of untouched earth remained. That patch, roughly the size of a small table, became the center of quiet fascination for decades. Some said it marked where Clara had once stood. Others believed it was the last place she stitched. Farmers who tried to plow near it claimed their equipment jammed or their horses refused to move forward. In later writings, Dr. Lathrop referenced this event as proof that even in modern times, Oklahoma Territory's older shadows refused to settle. "Progress," he wrote, "does not erase what was measured into the land. It only builds over it." And so, while newspapers moved on and roads grew busier, the winds that crossed that forgotten track still carried a faint rhythm, two clean metallic clicks, and a silence long enough to imagine breath between them. By the early 1920s, the story of Clara Beaumont had drifted almost entirely into folklore. In Guthrie and Enid, her name appeared occasionally in local columns under the heading Frontier Oddities, though few knew the details. Yet in the scattered ranching communities that bordered what was once Oklahoma Territory, the legend still lived quietly, told beside lanterns, when the winds outside grew too still. In 1921, a traveling preacher named Reverend Amos Tiller claimed he had found remnants of the old Beaumont tract while following an abandoned cattle trail. His testimony appeared later in a church bulletin. "The grass was pressed in a circle, like some large form had lain there. I heard no birds, no rustle, save the faintest clipping sound. It was steady, deliberate, like cloth being cut for eternity." Skeptics dismissed Tiller's account as a frontierman's fancy, yet his report revived academic interest in the case. The Oklahoma Historical Quarterly reprinted excerpts from older Oklahoma Territory records, framing the story as an anthropological curiosity. Among the findings was a rediscovered affidavit, possibly belonging to Deputy Ezekiel Ward, describing unearthed fabric squares stitched with letters that do not correspond to any known name. That phrase, "letters that do not correspond," became central to renewed debate. Some scholars proposed it referred to initials lost to incomplete census records. Others, more poetically, claimed it was a code stitched by Clara herself, a private language of guilt or remembrance. In 1924, a small team of university historians conducted what they called an archaeological survey of the Beaumont site. They found little: fragments of charred wood, small rusted tools, and traces of iron oxide where the sewing table once stood. Yet one assistant, Harriet North, noted something strange in her field journal. "At dusk, light seems to bend oddly near the foundation. The shadow of my hand doesn't fall straight. It curves as if drawn toward the ground." The journal page ends abruptly. Harriet fell ill days after returning to Guthrie and never resumed her work. Her illness was never connected to the excavation, but among her papers her family found a cloth swatch tucked between pages, gray linen, rough-edged, marked faintly with an embroidered H. Even as superstition waned, these coincidences kept the legend alive. The cat, too, continued to appear in passing remarks. A dark figure seen along the ridge, watching surveyors and then vanishing when approached. Farmers joked that the creature was the land's accountant, ensuring no one disturbed what was buried beneath. By 1926, with Oklahoma's growth accelerating, new roads finally crossed near the old tract, but workers reported odd misfortunes: snapped tools, sudden gusts that extinguished lamps, and a chilling stillness in the soil. One foreman was quoted saying, "We'll lay the road a mile west. The ground here ain't settled, not in history nor in heart." And so, even as concrete poured and engines roared, the Beaumont land remained untouched, a silent square between progress and remembrance, guarded by whispers and the faint echo of shears closing somewhere just beyond the light. By 1928, modernity had swept across most of Oklahoma. Radio towers rose above fields that once held only silence, and towns prospered where wagon wheels had once left their tracks. Yet in that small, neglected tract near the Cimarron, the air still carried an absence that progress could not touch. The locals had stopped calling it the Beaumont Tract. Now it was simply the Square, a name whispered in half-jests, but avoided after dark. In a quiet corner of the Guthrie Library, a regional historian named Dr. Leonard Voss began compiling what he called the Frontier Misdeeds Ledger, a collection of unsolved disappearances and crimes dating from the old Oklahoma Territory years. Among his entries, the Seamstress case took up an entire section. Voss cited early clippings, the petitions against noises and odors, and the enigmatic reports of a black cat, which he saw not as supernatural, but symbolic, a creature of independence mirroring Clara's own isolation. Voss wrote in his preface, "It is not uncommon for the frontier's loneliness to manifest as myth. Yet myths persist only when anchored by something tangible, an object, a name, a pattern in soil." Determined to find that pattern, he visited the Beaumont site himself in late summer. The weather that year was strange: heavy air, still winds, and an amber haze that hung over the prairie. In his field journal, he noted a recurring sound beneath the hum of cicadas. 2 clicks, metal on metal, faint as a heartbeat. He collected soil samples and fragments of charred timber, but what disturbed him most was the presence of fine black fibers woven through the earth like thread. He sent samples to a laboratory in Tulsa, which returned the odd conclusion: animal hair, composition indeterminate. Voss's curiosity bordered on obsession. Over the next few months, he cross-referenced census lists and discovered that at least 8 individuals reported missing between 1876 and 1883 had connections to tailoring, freight hauling, or fabric trade. Though inconclusive, the overlap deepened the legend. One night, while reviewing his notes, Voss awoke to the sound of something brushing against his window pane. A faint scrape, rhythmic, deliberate. He described it later as a whispering sound, like fabric being drawn tight. When he opened the shutters, nothing was there. But on the sill lay a small scrap of linen, aged and brittle, embroidered faintly with LV. He never returned to the site after that. In an unpublished manuscript found years later, he closed the section on Clara Beaumont with a single line: "Some trades are never abandoned. They simply wait for the next hand to measure." The document ended there. By the 1930s, the land around the square was fenced off for agricultural use, though no crops thrived there. A few families reported livestock wandering toward it, only to stop abruptly and turn away. The black cat was sighted again by a schoolteacher driving home one winter night. She described its eyes as dull coins reflecting no light. The town's newer residents laughed at such stories, calling them dust tales. But among the older folk, especially those whose families had farmed there for generations, the silence of that patch of earth still commanded respect. They said that when the wind fell still, you could hear the faintest sound, soft, precise, unending, like scissors finding their mark in the dark. By 1933, the Great Depression had swept across Oklahoma, and hardship seemed to echo the ghosts of the past. Dust storms rolled in from the west, turning the sky copper and swallowing entire farmsteads. Amid the desolation, the legend of Clara Beaumont quietly resurfaced, not in history books this time, but in the whispered prayers of those who had lost everything. In a small relief camp near Kingfisher, a schoolteacher named Mrs. Elsie Crane began collecting stories from displaced families, One elderly widow told her of a time, decades earlier, when her father had warned her never to cross the old Beaumont ground. Said the land wasn't bad, it was busy. Said something down there was still working, still measuring. When Crane later published her recollections under the modest title Echoes of the Territory, she included the Seamstress tale as a parable of guilt and endurance. She referenced the Oklahoma Territory archives, noting that even official ledgers seemed reluctant to close the case. Her name, she wrote, remains written in soft pencil, as if someone expects her to come claim it. It was around this time that a series of strange letters began arriving at the local post office, each addressed simply to C. Beaumont, Oklahoma Territory. Postmasters set them aside as curiosities, but one clerk, William Dyer, opened a few out of curiosity. Inside were scraps of cloth, sometimes stitched, sometimes blank, all signed with the initials of missing persons, long rumored in local folklore. Dyer burned them after 2 nights, saying the cloth smelled like rain before a storm. In 1935, when the great dust clouds reached their worst, a farmer named Caleb Merton claimed that after one particularly fierce storm, the outline of an old cabin briefly appeared in the soil, clean angles, like walls drawn by invisible hands. He said the pattern vanished within minutes, wafted away by the wind, but he swore he heard a woman's voice humming, faint and steady, between the gusts. Newspapers brushed off the claim as mirage or grief. Yet Merton's neighbors found him the next day seated by the edge of the field, staring at an old rusted pair of scissors half buried in the dirt. No one knew where they had come from. Even the black cat, long part of the story's folklore, was seen again by travelers. A WPA photographer passing through captured an image of a dark feline form crouched on the foundation stones, though in the developed print the cat appeared translucent, its outline blurred by streaks of dust. In her later years, Mrs. Crane remarked in an interview, "If there ever was such a woman, maybe she's still working. Not wicked, just unwilling to stop." That sentiment struck a chord in the weary Depression-era audience. They saw Clara not as a monster, but as a spirit of endurance, the embodiment of work that continues even when all else fails. Still, a few locals held to the old warning. When the storms quieted and the prairie settled once more, they said you could hear the wind shift through the abandoned lot, clicking faintly like metal on wood, as though something beneath the ground was still busy, still cutting. By the late 1930s, progress had paved over most of Oklahoma's old trails, yet the Beaumont Square, as it was now labeled on county maps, remained conspicuously undeveloped. Surveyors noted the ground as unstable for construction, though no geological cause was ever identified. To most, it was simply an empty field. But to a few, it was a living relic of the Oklahoma Territory's strangest ghost story. That year, a university researcher named Dr. Helen Corbett arrived from Tulsa to document rural legends for a federal folklore project. Her team interviewed locals who still remembered the Seamstress tale. One rancher, Luther Dean, offered her an account that she transcribed word for word. "You don't hear her at first, you feel her, like your coat's being sized up. My daddy said the measure's still running, that's why the wind never stops right here." Dr. Corbett was skeptical but thorough. Her field notes reveal an increasing fascination with the pattern of events that followed attempts to reclaim the land. She observed that every major effort to plow or build upon the Beaumont tract ended in machinery failure or injury. "It's coincidence," she wrote, "but too consistent to ignore." One night, during her stay in Guthrie, Corbett reportedly visited the site alone. In her notebook, a final entry reads, "Heard metallic rhythm. Too short, one pause. Found a cat's paw print beside my boot. No cat visible." She fell ill within days and returned to Tulsa. Her colleagues later published her incomplete manuscript under the title The Needle in the Prairie, where she connected Clara Beaumont's legend to the psychological strain of isolation among women settlers. Corbett referenced Oklahoma Territory records to contextualize the social pressures that might have shaped the myth. She argued that the seamstress represented a convergence of guilt, grief, and survival, the thaw, mining shadow of the frontier. Her interpretation gave the story a new dimension, Less about haunting, more about endurance and forgotten labor. Still, some insisted there was more than metaphor in the wind. In 1939, a group of high school boys from Guthrie dared one another to camp near the old foundation. They brought lanterns and an old Victrola to play music, laughing at the idea of ghosts. But sometime after midnight, the gramophone needle began to skip in rhythm. Click, click, pause, click. The boys swore the sound came not from the machine, but from the earth itself. When dawn came, one of them found a thread looped around his boot, tightly knotted though no spool was near. Years later, one of those boys, Frank Ellison, would become a county clerk. In a 1970 interview, he recalled, "It wasn't fear. It was like the ground was counting us." The tract remained untouched. Even in the booming post-war years, when new highways were built nearby, every attempt to cross that land failed. Bulldozers stalled, stakes bent, and by the time the engineers rerouted the road, locals said the black cat was seen again, perched silently atop a stone, tail curled neatly, as if guarding something best left unmeasured. By 1941, the dawn of war had drawn national attention far from local legends, yet the old stories of Oklahoma Territory endured quietly in the margins of memory. When rationing and resource drives began, the County Women's Committee gathered fabric donations for uniforms and blankets. Among them was Mrs. Edith Rowe, who lived on a small farm bordering the old Beaumont Square. According to her daughter's later recollection, Edith insisted on sewing outdoors, saying she liked the light and the wind, but neighbors noticed she chose her spot carefully, always within sight of the square, but never stepping onto it. One afternoon she returned home pale and silent, carrying a folded piece of cloth unlike any she had owned. Her daughter described it years later. It was rough, old-fashioned linen, like from a century back. Mom said she found it on her sewing basket, though she'd left it closed. Edith cut the cloth into patches to use for quilt lining, but when she began to stitch, her needle bent, as if striking something hard within the weave. She stopped, packed the fabric away, and burned it the next day. For months afterward, she swore she heard soft clicks when she worked her treadle machine. Always two quick, one slow. That same year, a local journalist, Samuel Croy, wrote a short feature called The Seamstress of the Plains, Fact or Fancy. Drawing from Corbett's federal folklore files, he attempted to reconcile myth with record. Croy mentioned the Oklahoma Territory as a cradle of unfinished histories, where law and legend blended. He cited the curious pattern of initials stitched into recovered fabrics, and suggested Clara might have used her trade to conceal messages, or even money. A theory without proof, but compelling enough for readers to debate. Soon after the article's publication, Croy received an anonymous envelope containing a single photograph, a blurred sepia image showing what appeared to be a sewing table in an empty field with a dark shape crouched beneath it. The reverse of the photograph bore no markings except one faint line written in spidery script, measured in silence. No one ever claimed responsibility for sending it. Croy displayed it briefly in his office before giving it to the Guthrie Historical Society, where it later went missing. During the following winter, townsfolk once again reported fleeting glimpses of a black cat prowling near the old foundation stones. In daylight, it was said to vanish completely, but at night, its outline appeared whenever moonlight touched the frost. One farmhand said he saw it sitting atop a low wall, tail twitching in rhythm, with some unseen movement, as though listening to a sound no human could hear. By 1945, as the war drew to a close, the Beaumont story had become little more than a campfire tale. Yet, for those who lived near that quiet field, there remained an unspoken understanding. Some places simply do not rest, and some trades, no matter how small or humble, keep working long after their makers are gone. And still, on still nights after harvest, travelers swore they could hear a faint hum beneath the cicadas, steady, patient, like scissors closing through the dust of time. By the early 1950s, the countryside around Guthrie had modernized. Tractors replaced horses, and new roads carved clean lines across once wild land. But no one ever built over the Beaumont Square. The plot appeared on surveys as unusable field, despite lying on stable soil. It was said that even mechanical plows would seize up when crossing its edge, their engines sputtering into silence. A regional historian named Professor Martin Clay took renewed interest in the story while writing a book on Oklahoma Territory folklore titled Echoes Beneath the Dust. He traveled through small towns collecting oral accounts and letters tied to the legend of Clara Beaumont. One of his first discoveries was a faded newspaper clipping from 1881 describing the vanishing tailor of the plains. Clay believed Clara had been real, possibly a victim of isolation and the hardships of pioneer life. But what caught his attention were consistent reports of unfinished fabric found buried or folded near her property decades after her disappearance. In an interview, Clay said, "If myths repeat in the same place for generations, we must treat them as memory, not madness. Perhaps the soil remembers what the people wish to forget." While revisiting Guthrie in 1953, Clay decided to spend a night at the edge of the old Beaumont tract. He kept a field recorder running, a relatively new device then, and noted the faintest metallic resonance near midnight. Later, playback captured only 2 muffled clicks, then static. Still, Clay swore he'd heard something rhythmic beneath the sound of wind. His notes mention an unsettling discovery the next morning. A small patch of ground where grass had been pressed flat, forming a neat rectangle. Within it, he found a thread of black fiber no longer than a finger. Laboratory analysis in Oklahoma City revealed it wasn't cotton, silk, or animal hair. Unknown compositine. The report read. Clay published his findings in a local magazine, sparking brief public curiosity. Reporters came, photographers posed, and for a few weeks the legend of the Seamstress flickered back to life. But after heavy rains that spring, the tract flooded unexpectedly, erasing every footprint and marker left by visitors. Locals took it as the land's quiet reminder that it had already been measured once and needed no more. In one of Clay's final letters before his death in 1957, he reflected on the persistence of such stories. Every generation rethreads its fears through old cloth. The seams may differ, but the pattern holds. And so the legend settled once again into silence, its last known scholar buried not far from the town that first recorded it. The site returned to grass, patient and unchanged, though a few farmers swore that when the wind blew across that square at dusk, it sounded faintly like fabric tearing in two. No one plowed it again. The boundaries, though unmarked, remained as invisible lines of respect, a measured space between memory and myth, watched, as always, by a patient black shape that moved when no one was looking. By the early 1960s, the Oklahoma plains had changed beyond recognition. Towns that once depended on lantern light now glowed under highway lamps, and new subdivisions crept outward from Guthrie's limits. Yet even as modern roads surrounded it, the old Beaumont Square remained unclaimed, 4 acres of undisturbed grass, bordered by barbed wire and silence. A young surveyor named John Mallory, working for a state mapping project, noted the empty tract as a cartographic anomaly. Curious, he camped there overnight to complete elevation readings. The next morning he filed a simple, cryptic remark in his report. No sound past midnight. Instruments fine until 12:03, then stopped. Felt pressure, like air too thick to breathe, leaving. His colleagues dismissed the comment as exhaustion, but Mallory later told friends he'd heard something rhythmic beneath his tent floor. 2 quick metallic taps, followed by 1 slow scrape. He said it reminded him of scissors dragged through heavy fabric. Around that same time, a historian and radio host, Laura Dent, began broadcasting a weekly segment called Ghosts of the Territory. One episode revisited the Seamstress legend, tying it back to women's frontier labor and loss. She referenced Oklahoma Territory archives that still held partial records of the original petitions describing odors and nocturnal noises near Beaumont's cabin site. Dent's calm narration and somber tone struck a chord with listeners, many of whom wrote letters sharing family tales about the black cat and the clicking wind. Dent herself claimed not to believe in hauntings, but during a live broadcast in 1963, her studio microphone captured a faint background sound, two metallic clicks, clearly audible between her words. Listeners called the station in alarm, insisting it was part of the story. Dent maintained afterward that no such noise had been in the room. By the following spring, journalists flocked to Guthrie to investigate. They found the field quiet, unremarkable, save for one detail: a small circular depression in the grass, roughly the size of a sewing table. Beneath it lay fragments of corroded metal, identified as the remains of 19th-century shears. The find reignited the legend. Newspapers dubbed it the Stitcher's Ghost Unearthed. Yet the interest faded as quickly as it came. No museum claimed the fragments, and within weeks they disappeared from storage. A janitor later claimed he saw a woman in a long gray dress walking the corridor the night they vanished. Her steps measured, deliberate. No one else saw her. The story returned once more to silence, but the land never lost its patience. Locals say that when the dusk settles and wind drops to stillness, the field grows unnaturally hushed. No crickets, no rustle. And if you linger long enough, that old rhythm returns. Click, click, pause, click. Whether it's the echo of scissors, the settling of the soil, or the work of something unseen, no one knows. But those who live nearby say they keep their distance, not from fear, but from a quiet respect for a woman who once measured more than cloth, and whose trade, somehow, has never ceased. By the 1970s, Guthrie's outskirts had become dotted with gas stations and motels catering to the new interstate traffic. Travelers passed the Beaumont Square every day without realizing what slept beneath the calm grass. Yet for those who had grown up hearing the story, the field still carried a kind of reverence, a boundary that progress instinctively skirted. In 1972, a photography professor named Eleanor Pike from Oklahoma State University began a project on vanishing places of the frontier. When she learned about the Seamstress legend, she was intrigued not by the supernatural claims, but by the persistence of absence. A place that refuses to be filled, she called it. She visited the square during late autumn, setting up a large format camera to capture its stillness at sunset. In her journal, she wrote, "Light dies faster here. I swear I can hear something faint, like a heartbeat in the grass." Her photographs, later displayed in a local gallery, were unlike any others from the project. Viewers noticed thin white streaks along the lower frame, vertical, parallel lines that looked uncannily like threads. Pike dismissed them as lens flares until one curator pointed out that the streaks formed a pattern. Pairs, always in sets of two close, one slightly apart. Click, click, pause, click. The following year, a windstorm tore through Guthrie, toppling several trees, but leaving the Beaumont Square untouched. When residents surveyed the damage, they found the field perfectly smooth except for one anomaly: a narrow strip of scorched earth tracing the outline of what once had been Clara Beaumont's cabin. In the center stood a single rusted thimble, half buried in dust. A few days later, Professor Pike returned to photograph the site again. In her notes, she mentioned seeing a black cat watching her from the edge of the field. "It didn't blink," she wrote. "It just sat there, tail folded neatly, as if waiting for me to finish." She took several photos, but when developed, the cat was absent. Only a shadow remained, and faint impressions in the grass where it had been. Local newspapers briefly revisited the story, framing it as nostalgia rather than mystery. Yet Pike's photos reignited quiet debate among historians who still studied the Oklahoma Territory period. A columnist remarked, "For a legend with no proof, it has a habit of photographing itself." By 1978, developers once again proposed building near the square. This time, a small housing community. They laid stakes, mapped utilities, and began preliminary grading. Within a week, every piece of machinery malfunctioned. Engines died. Tools disappeared overnight. A construction foreman claimed he found one missing wrench embedded upright in the soil, balanced perfectly on its handle. The project was abandoned before year's end. the land reverted once again to private ownership, fenced off but unworked. And on nights when the wind passed softly through the prairie, travelers said they could still hear the faint sound of metal whispering beneath the earth, steady, precise, eternal, as though the soil itself had never stopped stitching its story together. By the early 1980s, the Seamstress legend had become a faint echo, an old tale mentioned occasionally at local fairs or by radio hosts looking for ghost stories to fill late-night airtime. The Oklahoma Territory connection had faded into the realm of folklore, yet the story refused to die. Each generation found new fragments, new interpretations, and always that same thread of unease. In 1982, a local historian named Daniel Mercer began researching forgotten women of the frontier. Among the documents he reviewed was a parcel of microfilmed letters written by a 19th-century post clerk in Guthrie. One contained a chilling reference. Received one more package for the woman who never came, addressed to C.B. marked fragile. Inside were needles, rusted and bound by a black thread. Mercer traced the postmark to a nearby settlement that had ceased to exist by 1884. The package, he realized, had been mailed during the final years of Clara Beaumont's known presence on the plains. The find reignited his interest and the public's. Local papers ran headlines like, "Did the Seamstress send her own ghost mail?" Soon after, Mercer organized a modest excavation of the Beaumont Square, funded by a state heritage grant. For the first time in nearly a century, the soil there was disturbed systematically. Within 2 days, workers unearthed an iron object roughly the size of a sewing machine pedal, fused solid by rust. Beneath it lay fragments of unrecognizable fabric, gray, stiff, and layered as though folded many times. On the third morning, the crew found what Mercer described as a delicate metallic form, curved and symmetrical. He believed it to be part of a large pair of shears, but when he returned after lunch to document the find, the artifact was gone. The workers claimed no one had touched it. That evening, Mercer noticed a figure standing at the far end of the field, tall, motionless, draped in gray. He called out, but the form dissolved into the dusk. When he examined the ground the next morning, he found 2 impressions side by side in the grass, like knees pressing down, and between them a single black cat's paw print. He left the site that day and never returned. His final field entry, dated October 8, 1982, read only, "The measure continues. Some stories don't end. They wait to be rethreaded." After Mercer's death, his daughter donated his notes to a museum in Enid. In the box was a sealed envelope addressed simply, "For the next who hears it." The museum never opened it. By the decade's end, new developments surrounded the field. Gas lines, paved roads, streetlights. But the Beaumont Square itself remained untouched. Even now, pilots flying low across the area at dusk claim that their instruments falter for a few moments directly overhead, the compass needle trembling before righting itself. Locals shrug off the phenomenon as magnetic interference, though a few still speak softly of Clara, of the black cat, the folded cloth, and the quiet rhythm that no machine can quite explain. And in the long breath between wind gusts, some swear they hear it still. Click, click, pause, click. By the 1990s, the world beyond Guthrie had changed entirely. Satellites orbited above, highways hummed across the prairie, and history itself had become something digitized. Yet for all the progress, the old Beaumont Square remained as it always had, a measured void in the middle of movement, its boundaries unchanged, its grass unmoved. In 1994, a group of students from Oklahoma City University filmed a short documentary on forgotten frontier myths. Their project, Whispers of the Territory, devoted one segment to the Seamstress legend. The crew interviewed aging residents who still remembered the story. One woman, Mrs. Lucille Price, then in her 80s, recalled how her father would pause his wagon when passing the site and tip his hat to the working lady. During filming, the students set up their camera on the field's edge. The footage captured nothing unusual, just tall grass and late summer light, until the playback. There, faintly, across several frames, thin white lines appeared, weaving in and out of the scene like invisible threads. The soundtrack contained a faint, steady rhythm. Click, click, pause, click. The team dismissed it as interference until one noticed that the timing was irregular, like someone breathing between stitches. The footage was archived but never aired publicly. Years later, when the tapes were reviewed for restoration, that section had degraded beyond repair. Only the written transcripts survived. That same year, a maintenance worker repairing nearby fencing reported finding a rusted sewing needle driven into a fence post at eye level. It was perfectly straight, embedded halfway, as though pressed in by a deliberate, steady hand. He kept it as a curiosity until it vanished from his workshop weeks later. By century's end, most of Guthrie had forgotten the name Clara Beaumont. Only historians and storytellers still mentioned her, and, even then, only as a relic of early Oklahoma Territory folklore, a name spoken softly, half in jest. Yet the land remained oddly vacant, its soil unbroken, as though it refused the weight of new foundations. When aerial photos of the area were taken in 1999 for a highway expansion, surveyors noted a strange discoloration in the grass, a faint rectangular outline, darker than the soil around it. At its center, two smaller parallel marks, sharp, symmetrical, like open blades. The engineers marked it on their report as shadow variance. But to those who'd heard the stories passed down for over a century, it was something else entirely. The measure still running, the last cut unfinished. And so, the legend ended as it began, in silence and distance, under the same wide sky that once watched over a woman who stitched her solitude into fabric and left her story in the wind. Today, when the wind falls calm over that field near Guthrie, and the dusk hangs low enough to darken the horizon, locals say you can still hear it. Two crisp, metallic clicks, a pause, then one more, a patient sound, a practiced trade, still at work, forever measuring the silence of the plains.